How many times as a kid did you want to watch a horror film with your parents, and then after the film, you immediately regretted it because you were absolutely scared? Being a kid of the 80s and the 90s, we'll get into the 90s in a different video. I was born in 1983, so I still remember some of the 80s, and I definitely remember watching 80s movies throughout my life as a child. And there was something about 80s films. Of course, I was a child at the time, and I'm sure everyone at a different age will have their own feelings. But for me, being a child of the 80s, growing up in the 80s as well, I absolutely adored horror films. Of course, I shouldn't be watching them, but I did, and I absolutely adored them. But at the same time, I was absolutely petrified after seeing those films. So today, I'm going to tell you some of the horror films that scarred me as a kid growing up. We'll get the most obvious one out the way, An American Werewolf in London. Now, of course, newer kids to the horror genre might watch this movie and laugh because it is quite a funny film. But when I was growing up watching any werewolf movie, because I'm absolutely petrified of werewolves, seeing An American Werewolf in London was absolutely horrifying for me, but I absolutely loved it at the same time. But for me, the practical effects was the most haunting part of this movie because even today, they still look totally realistic. Funhouse was a strange one. This one was directed by Toby Hooper, and I remember watching this one really young and not really taking it in or understanding it. All I remembered at the time watching it was quite an eerie film. Now, I love horror films that are set at carnivals and fairs, anything like that. I absolutely love because of the mood and the atmosphere. But Funhouse brings something a little bit deeper and scarier than that because it is that dark film. It had some themes in there that I didn't quite understand as a kid, but watching it as an adult, and I'm looking at it as an adult thinking, how did I even watch this film as a kid? But at the same time, when I was a kid watching this movie, I was intrigued because it did look creepy. The monsters in it were scary. Everything about it was just so scary to me as a kid. But then watching it as an adult, even realizing that it was Toby Hooper, the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that directed this one, I think to myself now, well, that's why. Next up, we've got Poltergeist 2, and I think you know what I'm going to say here. Reverend Kane was one of the characters that scared me growing up, and it's all thanks to Poltergeist 2. When I look back on the Poltergeist franchise, I think Poltergeist 2, not being the best film in the franchise, but for me it was the scariest, all because of that man. The number of scenes he was in was limited, but anytime he was on screen, it scared the life out of me. I haven't seen this film for a long time now, but the scenes that I remember are the scenes with him, so he obviously had a lasting impact on me. Next up, we've got Pet Sematary. Now this one, again, it's not just the story that's scary, because the story is quite scary, it's the characters within that story as well. There's numerous characters, there's numerous scenes throughout this film that scared me growing up as a kid, especially when there was a kid in the film, Gage, and I could kind of relate to Gage because he's round about my age. But the one thing that scared me the most about Pet Sematary was, of course, the character Zelda. Zelda's forms, the way that they shot Zelda in the scenes that she was in was frightening. And again, the characters like this are the ones that leave that lasting impression on you as a young kid growing up in the 80s. Next, we've got A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. Yes, a Part 2. Believe it or not, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1 didn't scare me. It didn't scare me at all. I don't ever remember being petrified by that film. Of course, Freddy Krueger was quite scary, but there was nothing in that film that scared me to death. It was quite a scary film and it had a scary premise. But I think what happens in part 2 is they take that scary premise and make it even scarier, because Freddy Krueger in this one was even scarier in my eyes, especially as a young kid. And some of the scenes in the film are pretty haunting and they scarred me for a long time, especially the scenes where Freddy Krueger is coming out of people's bodies. He's coming into the real world. He's killing people at this barbecue. We see the demon dogs. There's just so many things in this film that outdo the first movie. Like I said, the first movie was scary, and the first movie is the better film, but when it comes to scaring a kid in the 80s, it has to be part 2. Next on the list is The Fly with Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. This one, when you're a kid, you don't really think of the storyline. The story is quite sad, and watching it now, it actually puts a tear in my eye, but it didn't do that when I was a kid. It didn't bring tears to my eyes because I was sad. It brought tears to my eyes because I was scared. There's something about 80s body horror that stands on a pedestal of its own. When it comes to the 80s films, we had to use practical effects most of the time. So when it comes to the body horror, it looked realistic. So if I took anything away from The Fly as the body horror, similar to new movies today like The Substance with Demi Moore, it's the body horror that scares you as a kid because it looks like something that could happen to you in real life. When you look at Zelda from Pet Sematary, it's just that type of body horror that gets to you as a young kid because you can't really differentiate reality to the movies at that age. Next up, we've got The Howling, and of course it is another werewolf movie. The Howling is considered one of, if not the best werewolf movie of all time, alongside An American Werewolf in London, and it also has a really good transformation scene, scenes that we don't really see today because it's all CGI. Hopefully they can bring that back with future werewolf movies. I don't hold out any hope, of course. But when you look back in the 80s when it comes to werewolf films and transformations, The Howling is the one that really catches your eye, especially as a young kid. I didn't see this movie when it first came out because I wasn't born yet, but I saw it in later years, maybe the late 80s that I saw this film, and I also saw it in the 90s and so on. But it's one that had a lasting impression on me because I always remember that transformation scene. Forget the storyline because you don't really think of storylines as a kid. It's that transformation scene that really got to me. Next, we have The Thing, and it's very similar to The Howling without the werewolves, is transformation scenes, body horror, just those practical effects that still stand the test of time today. When I watch The Thing, I watch it all the time. And when I watch The Thing even today, I watch it and think that looks like a film that would be out in 2024. The practical effects look outstanding. So just think how we felt as kids in the 80s watching that film. That blew our minds because it looked absolutely real. There's some scenes in the film that really got to me when the kind of spider legs come out of the head, when the dogs were turning into these monsters, as we called it as kids. So there's just so many scenes in The Thing that really got to us as kids. Watching it as an adult, you appreciate it even more because they still get to you as an adult, but you appreciate the storyline as well. Next, we've got Scarecrows. Now, I'm kind of cheating here because Scarecrows was a film that scared me before I saw it. And then when I watched it, I was a little disappointed. Now, I'll explain that. When I went to the video stores as a kid in the 80s, I would always see the front cover of Scarecrows and I would always beg my parents to rent this movie. Regardless if it was good or bad, I wanted to rent it because of that front cover, because it scared me. I wanted to be scared as a kid. So they eventually rented Scarecrows because, hands up to my parents, they're absolutely awesome. People today probably wouldn't like them because they let me watch horror films, but I love them for that. But we would rent the Scarecrows, we put it on, and I watched it, and I remember not being really scared of the film. There were some scenes that were quite creepy, but when you put it up against the films on this list, it's one of the least scariest. But I was petrified of the film before watching it, simply because of that front cover. Last on the list, we've got The Fog by John Carpenter. Any John Carpenter movie, apart from Big Trouble in Little China, scared me to death as a kid. And The Fog was one of the ones higher on the list. I think The Fog, compared to Halloween, for example, which is the greatest horror movie of all time, is a lot scarier than Halloween. Of course, the premise of Halloween is scarier, but the look of The Fog to me was scarier. The characters, the bad guys in the film were scarier. And it's all down to the mood and the atmosphere of The Fog, because that was what really brings you in to the movie as a young kid growing up in the 80s. But for me, I think what scared me the most about The Fog wasn't the characters. It was the situations that these people were in. You've got people trapped in these buildings. They're trying to hold on to the doors. The fog's coming in. And as a kid, I'm like, get out of there, get out of there. I got really scared as a kid because of those scenes. So I think the tension building by John Carpenter and The Fog was what scared me the most. So that was the scariest 80s movies that kept me up at night as a young kid in the late 80s, guys. But my question to you is, what is your experiences growing up in the 80s? If it was in the 80s, you can, of course, let me know if it was a different decade for you, the 60s, 70s, 90s, the noughties. Whatever decade a horror film scared you, leave some examples down below of those films that just scarred you as a young kid. And also, guys, fear not, I will be doing a 90s films that kept me up at night as well. Because I am a kid of the 80s and the 90s, it's only fair that I do a 90s video as well. So look out for that one. But as always, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon.
Meeting adjourned. right back!
What are you waiting for, huh?
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played Skin the Cat?
Someone's in the back!